Okay. Okay, everyone, we're about ready to get started, so if you can find a seat. Okay, welcome to Liberty Remnant Church and tonight's presentation with Dr. Erica Lee. To start with some logistics, as you came in the front door, if you go to the left, so back over here, there's a hallway, and we have 3 bathrooms down that hallway on the left. Tonight, I know that there's many different opinions here in this room, and I trust that you've all come here to hear Dr. Lee, and you'll give her respect and courtesy, and this will be her speaking tonight, her words, sharing her views, and these are not the views of her employer. I want to remind us all that this is a speech and not a debate. A speech, not a debate. There will be a time for question and answers at the end of tonight's speech. And I wanted to share a personal story of my own. I have a lifelong friend from childhood on up. Here a few years ago, this person went through a full transition. And it has changed our relationship. There's no doubt about that. But we have remained friends. And I've chosen to maintain connection with him, to love him, to respect him, and still treat him as a friend. And with that, it reminds me that for Liberty Remnant Church, for EWAFA, for myself, for Dr. Lee, we believe that all people should be valued, respected, appreciated for the God-given talent that's placed in them. There is no room for hate in this place where we are. And there is no room for hate in my heart, and I hope that's the same for all of us. With that said, I want to share a brief bio on Dr. Lee. She is a Spokane pediatrician who is a graduate of Stanford Medical School. Okay, sorry, Stanford undergrad. Thank you for the correction. Can you believe this? I'm getting a phone call. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Anyway, Stanford is one of the leading universities in the nation. They have a leading medical school, a leading university, and a very respected institution. Dr. Lee is an advocate, a strong supporter of free speech. And there's a deep reason that is ingrained in her. I just recently found this out. Her grandfather was martyred in communist China back 75 years ago. And so the fire that burns in her for free speech, that's a legacy passed on from her grandfather. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Erica Lee. Please give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ron. Genes, gonads, gametes, and genitals. This is the story of sex development. As you can see, gender is not part of my title, but I will talk about that too. As I sat in the Mead School District Board meeting on March 24th, and as people presented their views on whether males should be included in female-only spaces and female sports, I was impressed. I was impressed with the civility with which the meeting was conducted. And it's not easy to be a minority voice in the room. I was also impressed with a claim that was put forth by some of the high school girls who wanted to keep males in female-only spaces and female sports. And the claim was that the number of people who are non-binary when it comes to their sex is as numerous as people with red hair. That is an extraordinary claim. Is it true? Is it true that it is possible to be non-binary when it comes to your sex? The objective for today, over the next 40 minutes or so, you will learn about normal sex development. We will talk about disorders of sex development, DSDs, and how queer activists use DSDs to create pseudoscience that's embedded in gender ideology. We will define male and female in scientific terms, and finally distinguish among determinants of sex, definition of sex, and consequences of sex. To begin with a case, this is Iman Khalif, women's Olympic boxing champion in 2024 in Paris. There was controversy at the time that this was a man. We all know that Muslim women are known to do this. Oh, but look, there is a press conference, and what is a woman? Clearly, it just means putting on makeup, airbrushing the photo, some flowery earrings. So at this point, I would like to allow the audience to just read through this list. Is there one test that is most useful in settling the question? And just for fun, I kind of want a show of hands who thinks each of these will be the most useful. So who wants a review of the medical record to see sex recorded at birth? Okay. And this is not like necessarily only one answer is correct. I just wanted to see where the audience is at. A physical exam of the relevant external anatomy. A doctor is just going to look at the area and then make a report. Who wants to do that? Okay. Who wants an ultrasound of the pelvis to look at pelvic organs? See if there are uterus, what kind of gonads we have. Okay. A karyotype to see the sex chromosome, XX or XY. Okay, this seems to be pretty popular. Measure the level of testosterone in the blood. Who wants to stick a needle in the gonad and see if it is an ovary or a testicle? Oh, okay. All right. So all these tools are available to us. So just a couple of definitions. In my title, gamete is part of the title. That just refers to egg or sperm, also known as germ cells. And then gonad refers to ovary or testis. So after today, none of you will ever refer to testes as part of your genitalia. They are gonads. Okay? Mixing that up really drives me nuts. Okay, so here is the sequence of sex development. You have chromosomes in each of your cells. You have 23 pairs. One of those pairs is a pair of sex chromosome, and they have genes on them. These genes are involved in determining whether the bipotential gonad in a human embryo is going to go down the ovarian or testicular path. This happens at about the 5th week after conception. By around the 8th week after conception, the ovary or testis is committed, and they're going to pump out hormones. These hormones, whether they're male hormones or female hormones, is going to determine what kind of genitalia you're going to have. You have both external and internal genitalia, and I will explain that in a minute. So this whole process so far generally is complete around 16 weeks after conception. And then the baby just gets bigger in the uterus, and the baby is born. And then finally, in puberty, there is the development of secondary sex characteristics, and you learn about in your health class. So this whole process takes like 13 years. A little bit more about genes. Okay, so there's a squirrel and his nuts. So genes determine gonads. It's these sex-determining genes that are on the sex chromosomes. I want you to think about chromosomes like bookshelves, and the bookshelves have instruction manuals in them or books in them. The books are generally filed very neatly on the bookshelves, but very rarely there can be some cases where the books get shuffled around or a book can get lost. It is the instructions on the genes that will be the ones that's determining what kind of gonad you're going to have. So these are just some of the names of the genes that are involved in determining whether you're going to get ovaries or testes. And then once the gonads are formed, then they're going to make hormones. You guys have all heard of what hormones are. But exactly how do we define them scientifically? Well, a hormone is a bioactive molecule that is produced by an endocrine gland, and it goes into the bloodstream to have a profound effect on a distant organ or several distant organs. Now, how do hormones know where to go? They don't have GPS system, they don't have eyes. Well, they just go everywhere in the body. They go where the blood goes. But the target organs have receptors on them, so they can receive the message at the time that the hormones are in the blood. So you can think of hormones kind of like radio waves. The radio waves goes out into the world from the tower, and you have to have the radio wave antenna to receive the message. So the hormones will determine genitalia, outer genitalia you're familiar with. What are internal genitalia? So here in black and white, there are two sets of tubes. Internal genitalia you can think of as tubes. In males, there are the vasa differentia, vas deferens. That's the part that they snip during a vasectomy. So that's in black. And then in white would be the female tubes, which are the fallopian tubes and the uterus. The uterus is just formed by fusing together two tubes. So the male hormones are going to delete the female tubes and promote the growth of the male tubes. And the female hormones will do the reverse. They will delete the male ones and promote the female ones. So now we're ready to talk about disorders of sex development. Here is an ultrasound. I assume the arrows are pointing at genitalia that may be kind of ambiguous, and the ultrasonographer cannot tell if this is going to be a boy or a girl. Okay, so what happens if something goes wrong with the step of the genes determining the gonads? So remember our friends, the SRY, the DAX1. In De La Chapelle syndrome, there is a fluke in the father's sperm making. And it's not like all his sperm are affected, just one sperm is affected. And that turns out to be the winner. So that sperm is carrying the X chromosome. However, there is a piece of the SRY gene, which stands for sex-determining region of the Y. That gene somehow got off of a Y chromosome, and it got stuck onto either this X chromosome or one of the other 22 autosomal chromosomes. So the embryo would have De La Chapelle syndrome, which means it is an XX embryo plus an SRY gene. And the presence of that SRY gene is enough to turn on testicular development. So even though this embryo is XX, it's going to go down the male developmental path. The dose-sensitive sex reversal is kind of like the opposite. The embryo is XY, but there is a duplication of the DAX1 gene, which is an ovarian-promoting gene. And when you have that, it's called an overdose of DAX1. And this would turn a path that was going to go down the testicular path into an ovarian-promoting path. So in dose-sensitive sex reversal, somebody is XY, but will end up with ovaries. A couple of different ones. Turner syndrome, you may have heard of this before because it's among DSDs, this is one of the ones that's a little bit more common. Instead of having 23 pairs of chromosomes, the sex chromosome doesn't have a partner. So they have 45 instead of 46 chromosomes, and they're missing a sex chromosome. All of these people are female, but they have issues with fertility, and they also look a little bit different. Klinefelter syndrome is 47XXY, so there's an extra sex chromosome. And they're always male, but they also have issues with fertility, and they look a little bit different. So those are some of the conditions that can happen if the genes don't match the gonads. Now, what happens if something wonky happens with the hormones? Do you mind hand me that water bottle there? Okay, so in these conditions, there is nothing going wrong from genes to gonad, but something is wonky with the hormones. So this is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. It turns out that your gonads are not the only endocrine gland that can make sex hormone. The adrenal glands, which makes your adrenaline, it also makes sex hormones, primarily male sex hormones. So even females have adrenal glands that make a little bit of male sex hormone. In this condition, the baby is missing the enzyme that helps you make the hormone that balances your salt and water. So all the precursors that's supposed to go into making that hormone called aldosterone ends up making male hormones instead. This is a life-threatening condition, so we universally screen for this in every single baby that is born. But the consequence of having been exposed to a lot of male sex hormone in utero is that the genitals become masculinized. So in a baby boy, this can happen to both baby boys and baby girls. In a baby boy, it's a little bit harder to detect visually, so we get the genetic screening back and we will find this out. But in girls, it's visually obvious. So this is a masculinized set of female genitals. You can see the labia majora, and that in the middle is not a penis, it's an enlarged clitoris. There's another condition called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. So in this condition, normally testosterone is converted into dihydrotestosterone via this enzyme. But if you're missing this enzyme, then testosterone cannot convert to dihydrotestosterone when the baby is still inside the uterus. It is dihydrotestosterone instead of regular testosterone that virilizes, that masculinizes the outer genitals in a baby boy. So when these babies are born, they look like girls on the outside. But a strange thing happens during puberty. Guevedosis means penis at 12. So they do have testicles inside their abdomen. And during puberty, sometimes these testicles will descend into the scrotum so that they will also get visible testes, and then their penis will start to grow. So that's why it's called the penis at 12 syndrome. So it could be kind of confusing for the individual. But in the Dominican Republic, there are quite a few of these cases, and then it becomes culturally accepted that some people are just born as girls and then they turn into men, and then they marry women and have children and become fathers. Okay, complete androgen insensitivity. This is an interesting one too. These people are XY. So remember when I talked about testosterone? It has a lot of different effects on different organs in your body. These people do not have receptors to testosterone. So they look like females on the outside. The testosterone, actually, the level of testosterone in the blood is quite high, and their internal abdominal testes are pumping out testosterone, and the testosterone is screaming, masculinize me, but nobody can hear it. And then they kind of go through a feminine puberty, which is kind of weird. How does that happen? Well, it turns out that in your skin and fat tissue, even in typically developing men, there is an enzyme called aromatase, which converts a little bit of testosterone into estrogen. And estrogen does have useful physiological effects on men as well. It's, for one thing, it will stop you from growing. So if you don't have estrogen, men, well, from some of the cases that we've found where men lack estrogen receptor, they grow more than they should. So these people do have estrogen receptors, and that's how they get breasts and widened hips. Also, because they don't respond to testosterone, they don't have armpit hair, and they don't have hair over their genitals. They don't have uteruses, they don't have fallopian tubes, and they have feminine-looking outer genitals. And this condition, it's very rare, so we don't universally screen for that. There is no reason to, because they're also, it's not a life-threatening condition, but it is nearly impossible to diagnose this before expecting periods. And then when they're 15 or 16, they still don't get their period. They go to the doctor, and then we do ultrasound, we do an exam, we look at the blood, we do a karyotype, and then we find out that they are males. Okay, so back to Imane Khalif. What does this person have? Well, somebody in the sporting world knows exactly what the condition is, but they haven't publicized that. From the information that we do have, he probably has 5-alpha reductase deficiency, the penis at 12, the guaidosis syndrome, which means when he was born, he probably looked like a girl on the outside and was recorded female at birth. And that was probably what the controversy was about. But that record was wrong. And ever since puberty, it would have been apparent that this person is turning into a man. So he still won the women's boxing championship, which is quite a dangerous thing for the women who were competing with him. So far, we have talked about normal sex development, and we have gone over some disorders of sex development. We saw that some DSD conditions are diagnosed at birth, some are diagnosed prior to birth, and some at puberty. It's likely that some are never diagnosed. I have not told you anything that is controversial so far. Doctors and scientists have known about DSDs for a really long time without using them to justify gender ideology. The incidence of DSD is about 1 in 5,000, more or less, depending on how you count them. That is far more rare than people with red hair. The males that want access to female-only spaces and female sports, they don't have DSDs. So how do gender ideologues use the existence of DSDs to justify gender ideology and the idea that sex is not real, or sex is a spectrum, or there are like 16 different sexes? They make the argument that there is a chromosomal sex, a hormonal sex, and a genital sex. And trumping all of these is what they call gender identity, which they call brain sex. And that is how they want to redefine sex. Now, in order to redefine sex, you have to define it in the first place. Don't worry, I will do that in scientific terms in a bit. Because at this point, you might be thinking, I thought she said that sex is a strict binary, right? There are all these examples where people are kind of like ambiguous. So I will define sex. But back to the gender activists. They argue that your sex is ascertained by putting all these different aspects of sex which occur in a very organized fashion, linearly along a well-defined developmental pathway, and they just put it all in a blender and brrr, and that's how they cook up the notion that sex is not real. As we have seen, the concordance among all these different aspects of sex, whether you're male or female, is very high. But it's not perfect. It's kind of like the notion that each person has one head and one body, has a high concordance with reality. But it's not perfect. There are conjoined twins. Some bodies have two heads. It's also kind of like saying that day and night are not valid categories because dawn and dusk exist. So these are a few of the common themes in the way that gender ideologues like to argue. Their inner school is called queer theory. So queer theorists in their writings kind of promote some of these themes. They believe that if anything falls outside of the norm, it means that the norms are the problem. They believe that norms are socially constructed to oppress people, even if the norms are like from nature. They also believe that language creates reality. They're not so keen on the idea that objective reality exists. Hence, their insistence on using pronouns, because they believe that language makes things real. They are also really allergic to the idea of categories. They believe that the boundaries between categories are always blurry. And they believe that having things in black and white categories is another way to oppress people. Furthermore, queer theorists like Judith Butler, if that is a familiar name to anybody here, nobody has heard of Judith Butler. Well, she is really important because she is the grandmother of queer theory. And she argues that sex is but a performance. It is how you behave. It is how you interact with the world that tells the world what sex you are. In other words, queer theorists believe that gender stereotypes are more real than biological and physical reality. Well, gender activists are wrong. So here's a moment that you're waiting for. This is why you came today. The definition of male and female. This is from the Federal Health and Human Services website that was updated in February of 2025. Okay, here it goes. Female, the sex characterized by a reproductive system with the biological function of producing eggs. Male, the sex characterized by a reproductive system with the biological function of producing sperm. So I had a Bachelor's of Arts in Human Biology at Stanford, and then I went to medical school at UC Davis. I did not learn this definition about male and female at either institution. Instead, I learned about it through self-study from two intellectual heroes of mine, Colin Wright and Heather Heying. They are PhDs in evolutionary biology. So you can say that my mind has been colonized. Okay, so Colin is the host of Reality's Last Stand, which is a blog. He teaches a lot and speaks a lot about this topic. And he also goes to legislative sessions to testify about, as an expert witness, to testify about legislation regarding the issue of men and women. Heather is one half of a duo of the Dark Horse podcast with her husband, Brett Weinstein, who's also an evolutionary biologist. So back to the definition of sex, to biologists who study sex, like Colin and Heather, the definition of sex is not rooted in chromosomes or gonads or hormones or genitals. It is certainly not based on any kind of subjective identity. It is all about gametes. It is all about eggs and sperm. So let me continue reading from the guidance from the HHS, which was, again, written in February of 2025. Defining sex, that's the text that I'm reading from in red. Defining sex. There are only two sexes, female and male, because there are only two types of gametes. An individual human is either female or male based on whether the person is of the sex characterized by a reproductive system with the biological function of producing eggs or sperm. The sex of a human, female or male, is determined genetically at conception and is observable before birth. Having the biological function to produce eggs or sperm does not require that eggs or sperm are ever produced. Some females or males may not or may no longer produce eggs or sperm due to factors such as age, congenital disorders, or other developmental conditions, injury, or medical conditions that cause infertility. A person's sex is unchangeable and determined by objective biology. The use of hormones and surgical interventions do not change a person's sex because such actions do not change the type of gamete that the person's reproductive system has the biological function to produce. Rare disorders of sexual development do not constitute a third sex because these disorders do not lead to the production of a third gamete. That is, the reproductive system of a person with such a disorder does not produce gametes other than egg or sperm. This document is very accurate from a scientific standpoint. There is a long list of citation from biology literature that defines sex this way. Modern biology, I would say, has a history since the 19th century. Obviously, people have been doing agriculture, learning about plants and how to raise animals for like tens of thousands of years. But for biology to be modern, you need some understanding about the microscopic world. You need some idea about how inheritance works. So ever since the 19th century, sex has been defined by gametes. So I'm not just here to appeal to authority. I'm not here just to point to the government's website or a 19th century textbook to try to convince you why sex definition has to be based in gametes. I'm here to try to persuade you using logic and reason. The definition of sex has to be based on gametes because the definition has to work across all organisms that reproduce sexually. So for example, you are male in the same way that the stamens of this flower is male. You're female in the same way that a female duck is female. You're female in the same way that this turtle is female. You're male in the same way that a male tarantula is male. It turns out that thinking about the definition of sex in terms of chromosomes and gonads and genitals is a very anthropocentric way to think. At least it's very mammalian-centric. The natural world has more than just people and mammals in it. This definition has to work across all the different organisms that reproduce this way. For example, if you are a reptile, your sex is not determined by chromosomes at all. It is determined by the incubation temperature of the fertilized egg, so that the whole brood will come out the same sex. If you're a bird, on the other hand, your sex is chromosomally determined, but if you have two large sex chromosomes, ZZ, then you will be male. And if you're ZW, one large and one small sex chromosome, then you will be female. Also, it is the egg and not the sperm which determines the sex of the next generation. In other words, it is backwards and opposite of how it works in mammals. If you are a mammal, bird, or reptile, though, you are also gonochoric. This means that you, as an individual, do not change your sex throughout your entire life. You are only ever capable of producing either egg or sperm, but not both. There are creatures which are not gonochoric. They can change sex, right, in their lifetime. Or sometimes they're hermaphrodites, which means male and female occupy the same body. But still, we talk about male and female. I mean, what would define that if that's some sort of third sex? It's all based on what kind of gametes they're capable to produce. Turns out gender activists, or not just gender activists, but people in general, even biology students, they confuse the determinants of sex with the definition of sex. For example, just because mammals sometimes have chromosomes that fall outside of the XX and XY binary does not mean that each of these chromosomal setups is its own sex. So somebody who doesn't understand this point would think that there are 8 different sexes on this board. But the reality is this. If we applied the idea that each of this should be its own sex to reptiles, then every incubation temperature at which you could incubate the egg would also be its own sex. That would be absurd. So the definition of sex is different from the determination of sex. Gender activists also confuse sex traits or the consequences of sex with the definition of sex. Sex traits are consequences of having a sexually reproducing system. So if you are a male seahorse, the consequence of being male is that you take care of babies. All right, the females lay eggs into the male's brooding pouch, the male fertilizes them, and the babies come out, and he takes care of them. Just because he has a behavior that is more reminiscent of females in other species does not make him any less male. How do we know he's male? Because he produces sperm. Okay. This is a spotted hyena. All right, what sex is this individual? Wrong, it's female. And this is not an individual with a DSD. Every female spotted hyena looks like this. She has a pseudopenis. So it turns out that the placenta of the spotted hyena produces male hormone. So all the boys and all the girls are bathed in male hormone. And then the spotted hyena also has an interesting social hierarchy. All adult females outrank all adult males. So the consequence of that is that moms and babies eat before the adult males do. And that is just a special feature of their biology. So because they're like bathed in testosterone, all the females are also very aggressive. So how do we know that this is a female if sex were to be defined by testosterone levels, behavior, or what their genitals look like? Right? How do we know that this is a female? Because she produces eggs, and because she's a mammal, she also gets pregnant. I don't really want to think about the mechanism through which she gets pregnant. Okay. As we have seen, defining sex by making it a blended set of characteristics that includes all determinants of sex and all consequences of sex, plus the gametes, it does not bring any kind of conceptual clarity. This is conceptual soup. Actually, it's probably conceptual garbage. It's so unclear what is going on over here. And a chart like this gives you the kind of the semblance of veneer of complexity and academic legitimacy. But it's trash. The reality is this. Well, this is the clarity. This is what clarity looks like. So you have sex-determining systems, either determined by chromosomes or genes versus environment. Though sex-determining systems are not binary. Nobody thinks that they're binary. But they lead to sex. And sex is binary because there's only sperm and egg. There's no speg, there's no spurg, and there's nothing outside of them. Well, I guess there are spurgs, but they mean something different, right? Like they stand for like people with Asperger's or something like that. So different from gametes. And then as a consequence of sex, you have different morphology, physiology, behavior, and nobody says that those are binary. Okay, for a talk like this, I have to have a word on gender identity. Activists define it as a person's internal and deeply felt sense of being male or female. So this language is in all those school district policy. All right, but now we have learned that being female is having the biological function to produce eggs. Does anyone here want to tell me what that feels like? All right. So I am female. I am aware that I am female. and I'm okay with it, and some people might not be okay with that, but I don't have a gender identity. I just have a tethered reality. To wrap up, I want to make a larger point. Today's talk is not just about the biology of sex. It is about the nature of truth and the nature of science. Science must explain the natural world in a way that is consilient. Consilience means there is unity to knowledge, to truth itself. In other words, the totality of knowledge must not contain contradictions. Queer theorists like to make arguments that internally contradict each other all the time. Sex is not real, but there are 8 of them. Gender is just about how you express your personality and how you interact in the world and how you behave. But you better change your body through hormones and surgery in order to conform to those gender stereotypes. In fact, the more self-contradictory the argument, the more queer it is. And they really think that because part of queer theory is not about looking for truth, because they don't actually believe that objective truth exists. It is all about gaining power. So that is another theme in queer theory. In fact, they don't believe knowledge exists. They call it power knowledge, like it's part of the same thing. All right, but science does not work like queer theory. We can't have a theory of chemistry which contradicts a fundamental theory of physics. And we can't have a definition of sex that is different in a human than that in an octopus. The idea that the universe is comprehensible and self-consistent is an axiom upon which the entire endeavor of science depends. Ladies and gentlemen, ending gender ideology is not complicated, but it does involve diligence and courage. It involves every one of us advocating for scientific integrity. It involves every one of us learning, understanding, and speaking the truth. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was quite an education. Thank you, Erica. Tonight, we'd like to have an intermission. We've brought in some cake. I think everybody here likes cake. I love cake. And so we'll take 15 minutes, have some cake, and then ask you to come back, be seated, and we'll go forth in questions and answers. So thank you. And in the foyer. Thanks, Erica. All right, get some cake.